Well, welcome, Suzanne. We are so excited to have you join us today. I'm personally excited to get a chance. I've gotten to talk with you, and it's fun to kind of do that with the group. I think we first kind of got introduced to each other at World Council in Denmark, and here we are on this side of the pond talking virtually now. So it's great to be here with you. And we don't often read bios. We just kind of say, hey, tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll jump into some more just conversation together.
I'm glad you're not reading my bio. I think there's nothing more awkward than hearing your bio read. I don't know. The longer I go, the least I like it. So I much prefer just to give some highlights. I have been in this role now. I'll hit my 2-year anniversary in September, right after Labor Day. As for some of you who we've had the opportunity to spend time with, I apologize, there will be some redundancy, but you can't reinvent your bio, really. My whole career has been in service, in human services. I've only ever worked for nonprofits, with the exception of my college jobs and my high school jobs. And I really found my calling to service right after college, when I had the great fortune of joining the Peace Corps. And I will admit, at that point in time, I definitely was called by service, but I was also called by the romantic notion of going to live in another country and getting to experience that. But it really was one of the most formative experiences of my life, and it set me on this trajectory of wanting to continue to be in service. And so when I came back to the United States, my first job was working with an organization which is now part of Catholic Charities, but it is an organization that focuses on helping immigrants and refugees get acclimated to life in America. And that was just the beginning of finding my next place. I say that I've actually only really looked in my professional career. I've only ever really looked for a job, like actually was at a place where I'm like, I'm going to go find something different. And I've done that twice. And in both of those cases, I didn't get the job. And that has taught me, I think, or at least, I don't know, when I reflect back, my experience has been more that the jobs have found me, and they haven't necessarily been jobs either. And so that's been a really interesting reflection for me recently. Like the 2 times when I was like, I want this, I'm going to get this, I didn't get it. I had to wait until God and the universe was ready for that to happen for me.
Right. Yeah, it's a great description of like calling. It had to call you more than when you tried to call it. It didn't quite work that way. I gotcha. No, that's great. Well, kind of leading into that idea of calling, we really, Nancy set us up well. One of the main points of conversation on these calls is really just talking about how does your faith impact or really influence how you lead. So we'd love to hear that from you today.
I'll have to tell a little bit more about myself because it's the foundation to my faith in my leadership. In my childhood, my parents were very active in our church, and our family was very active in our church. I grew up mostly in Wilmington, North Carolina, and we moved there when I was in the 3rd grade. And I can remember 3 things about that period of my life. And that was my neighborhood. I lived in a really fun neighborhood with lots of kids and lots of bike riding and lots of playing outside. I remember my school, College Park Elementary School, which was in my neighborhood. And I remember St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. And I spent my time divided between those 3 places, sometimes equally, because I was really fortunate. And I don't know, this doesn't exist for me right now in my life, and it really hasn't even since I was a parent. But I lived in a neighborhood where a lot of my, and this speaks to the lack of diversity in my neighborhood very candidly, and that's a entirely other important conversation that we could have. But I lived in a neighborhood where our friends were friends at church too. So my family's friends were our church friends. So I just remember spending so much time in at St. Matthew's in my church life. And I had an awesome pastor. His name was Pastor Harold McSwain. And I would, in all honesty, would describe him as a fairly progressive Lutheran. He really challenged us to search and find and study other faiths and compare the elements of other faiths with the Christian faith. And it was at St. Matthew's where I had the opportunity to have my first camp experience. I went to Lutheridge, which is in the mountains of North Carolina, but it's a very faith-based camp. It still exists today. Fun fact, I watched their first Vespers was last Friday night, and I got to participate via Facebook. So that was kind of cool. They did it via Facebook. All that to say is, for me, going to Lutheridge, and I went to Lutheridge from 3rd grade to 12th grade, it really helped me integrate, I think about how you integrate the lessons of the teachings of Christianity into your decision-making outside of your church life. So in how you interact with people. And that just for me was foundational. So as I have, moved into my professional career, it would just be impossible for me to not think about what are the elements and values of my faith, because it's just part of who I am, I think. And I was the beneficiary of some early leadership training. And this was, I can kind of remember, when servant leadership was new, and then it's used, so often now.
Right.
But it made a ton of sense to me, even when it was kind of like, oh, this is a new way of describing leadership. In reflection, it made so much sense to me because it is, whether intended or not, seemingly built on the principles of the Christian faith, and I'm sure you could argue other faiths as well. When you look at not putting yourself in front of the needs of others.
Yeah. No, that's great. So with that, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but we'll have
you can put me on the spot.
Can you think of a even recent example or a time that, man, your faith really influenced how you showed up in a meeting or a decision you had to make, or how it's kind of you've interacted with that now as an adult?
I like to think that it shows up naturally almost all the time, but it doesn't. The more interesting conundrum that I find myself in some days is my natural leadership style is to show up with a great deal of listening and empathy and just, I don't know, like I do think I'm a servant leader. The conundrum sometimes is then that sometimes, depending on the environments you're in, is seen as not direct enough or not assertive enough, and you can be both things, but sometimes their assumptions get made when you lead with that more empathetic leadership style that you don't have the ability to make hard decisions, or sometimes if you tend to take a little more time in decision making because you're trying to figure out what is the impact on people, it can cause, you just have to be aware that you have to be open to criticism, that for people who may have a different leadership style. And I sometimes, I have a favorite saying now. I say, I think you're underestimating me, because my natural tendency might be to show up a certain way, and people assume that means action's not happening. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but so that's
sounds quite like Jesus was quite underestimated often. So
and I would never dare
alone in that. But
I don't ever want to compare.
You're not alone in that. I got you.
Yeah, I think for me the lesson in that is, if I can be so bold, is just not to compare myself with Christ, but to compare myself with the maybe experiences. Is sometimes your leadership isn't apparent in the moment, and it takes time for it to appear, or for it to be understood, or for it to be recognized or appreciated. And I'm quite comfortable with that.
Yep.
Yeah, so I remind myself of that.
Yeah, being willing to be misunderstood is a tough leadership challenge, but needs to be learned. That's great. Well, several times, I mean, I don't know when you're officially not new, but being newer CEO, I've heard on many occasions people will ask, what has surprised you, or what's something you didn't expect to find at the Y? And you've mentioned several things, but one of the things you mentioned is just the diversity around the C in the YMCA that maybe you didn't know about before stepping into the role that you're in now. So I guess I'm just more curious, kind of what specifically have you noticed, or maybe what kind of concerns does it raise? And then on the other side, opportunities are there with that diversity?
Well, first I want to say I have, and every day I feel this more, I do have an incredible appreciation to work in an organization where you can actually talk about faith and how faith shows up, really no matter what your faith is, but to be able to talk about how faith impacts who you are as a leader and how you show up and the organization that you want to create is like that has been really a lovely experience for me. And the only other place I ever found that was when I was leading in Maine, and there was an organization called Christian Leaders in Management and Business. And they put on this awesome Good Friday breakfast. And I remember going for the first time, and it was the first time I'd ever been exposed to a group of civic leaders really who had this construct of celebrating faith in a way that was really inclusive. And I also always said it was like the best service, no offense to anybody who's Catholic, but going to their Good Friday service always made Catholic Easter Mass in Massachusetts just look dull and boring. So it was always my excuse to stay home and hide the Easter eggs. But Dori, it's having said all that, I have been in conversations where being in an organization that has been built on the heritage of Christian values and the Christian faith, it was surprising. I don't know if it's surprising for me, as I say, I've come to appreciate that that's not all positive. And sometimes it feels like it's experienced as really negative. And I have also witnessed listening to different, why leaders talk about their perception of how our Christian heritage shows up in a way that may not be completely accurate. And so in the same way that we as Americans draw conclusions about people's beliefs or their political affiliations and what that means for them, I've witnessed that in our own network. And sometimes my experience has been is that I have yet to witness the real extreme that would substantiate some of the narrative that I've heard. And what I truly believe is, for me personally, it's, again, and I think you could say this is true of many faith traditions, is the core of who we are should bring us together and should not divide us. And so I do think there's an opportunity for dialogue within our movement about that. And because where I have seen people stop and listen and understand, they appreciate, and this happens in so many other kinds of conversations too. Right. They have an appreciation of, wow, maybe we're not so different, and maybe they do have a point of view that I should understand. I'll just very quickly share. I'm in DC this week, and this is the Youth Governors Conference, and so I spent the morning on the Hill with not only our youth governors from many of our states, but also some of our young program participants who are participating in the Changemakers program, so they've introduced community projects, and they're going to go through this competition. And I was at lunch with a group of they're all high school students, and Simon he's either from Wisconsin or Michigan, and I always get those wrong because I have this little dyslexic thing when it comes to W's and M's. But anyway, Simon was sharing the story that during COVID, he became so insulated with social media that he identified himself as being very progressive, and he only associated with people that shared his views. And these were political views, not religious views or views around faith. And that it was only until he got involved, and this was for a year, that he got in this cocoon because he wasn't outside, interacting. But when he finally was able to get involved with youth and government and start to meet people and participate, he said it was life-changing for him, because he realized that as he sat down with people to understand, again, this was in the political context, that while they came from different points of view, he started to appreciate there was some validity in other people's points of view. And it was all about talking and understanding. And I feel like we haven't created enough space in our movement to have that kind of conversation around, what does our Christian heritage mean? What do our Christian values mean? And what do they not mean? And there's some challenging places that we need to go together. But I just personally think we would benefit from having some more intentional conversation.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, the Ys always try to contextualize to our communities, but we don't want to reflect the division in our communities. We want to lead the way to help bring people together. So I think with that, there's some work I know I think you've been doing or interested in, and what it means for the Y to be a bridge builder. And how could we perhaps be an organization that leads the way in bringing dialogue and bringing, people with different thoughts, be it faith, be it politically, whatever it might be, together to actually learn from one another. And what role do you see the Y playing in that?
Well, one of the areas that we are, I don't know if I'd say we're dipping our toe right now, or we are locking arms and trying some new ways of showing up, is through, I think there's many ways we can do it. I mean, I think that, but I'll just share one example right now, and then Dori, you can add on, because you have been connected into one of the organizations, is this effort that we are now involved in with Habitat for Humanity International, Catholic Charities USA, and Interfaith America. And our 4 organizations have come together to, initially we talked about it as building a nation of bridge builders, and using the spaces and experiences that our organizations naturally have to invite people not just to be together, but to have some intentional conversation about bridge building. And in this initiative, Habitat, ourselves, and Catholic Charity are identifying the communities to try this work, and then Interfaith America, which I know you have been involved in and have some training in, so you would be a much better spokesperson for me as to what that looks like. They're our partner to help train our Y staff, to train their staff to help engage their community in bridge building conversations. And that can be bridge building around political polarization. It could be bridge building around the intersection of different faiths. It can be bridge building around, diverse views on anything. What programs should live in what parts of one city, for example. And so that's something that we just kicked off in April. And I'm really hopeful to see how that initiative is going to teach us more about our true ability to be a place where people can come together, and how can we get better at allowing intentional conversations to be part of what we do in community. It's just the beginning, but it's hard to think of any other organization, that you could stack up that could have the ability that we do.
That's great. It's almost like the 2.0 to listen first. If our value is we're going to listen first, now we have to create opportunities for you to listen first, and with people who think differently than you do, and maybe even believe differently than you do. That's great. That's great. And show up as that servant leader. That's awesome. Well, I'm excited that we're dipping our toes in, and yeah, I'm sure we may get some questions more about that. So that's great. Well, I'm going to pivot us a little bit on topic. So just to name, you are our first female CEO, which I think is great and exciting. And so with that, I kind of often, I guess, both questions today I've had is, what are the opportunities, or maybe what have been the barriers or the threats, and how have you had to confront some barriers, but also, embrace the opportunities?
I won't say this is a barrier, and I'll connect this back to some of my earlier comments about truly, for me, how I choose to advance the values of my faith into my leadership style. There's, and I don't want to stereotype, I think my leadership style, and partly my leadership style, may be driven by, gosh, I'm always careful. I don't want to stereotype myself, but I think there is an assumption, there can be assumptions that women aren't as strong as leaders as men, right. Particularly, so for me, I potentially exacerbate that for myself because I have this tendency to leave in the servant leader mode. And I have been in situations when I've been on a search committee, and honestly, I heard two of my male colleagues describe one of the candidates who described her leadership style as a servant leader as, that's not a strong enough leader for us, because there still are stereotypes around servant leader. And then, candidly, when you put gender with that,
right,
the stereotype can be perpetuated even more. And I've experienced that. I'd be lying if I didn't say that. But I also have a ton of gumption, and I love the challenge of proving myself as well, not necessarily in the most immediate and outward way. So it is a bit like maybe you're underestimating. And so I'm really comfortable with, they'll see in time, I'll prove myself in time. That notion has worked for me, and it continues to work for me. And it's true when I look across our movement, and there still aren't enough women, and there still aren't enough leaders of color in our associations. And that's just a fact. If we want to look like America, we don't look like America right now in terms of the representation of the leadership in our organization. And so for me, being the first woman leader, it gives me, I think, a really good platform to want to advance. And I fully intend to. If you ask me what I want my legacy, I have multiple aspects of that, but one aspect of my legacy is I do want to have made it easier for women to be seen as amazing, credible leaders, and to be supported and advanced. Last month, I had the opportunity to spend a day at our archives with Ryan Bean, who I saw is on the call. And if you haven't done that, it is so worth the trip. And one of he had pulled some archival materials and articles and files for me in some areas that he thought would be of interest for me, and one of which was the deliberations that took place as the YMCA was considering the inclusion of girls into programming and women into programming. And we joked a lot. We joked as we read some of the memos and the pamphlets, and at the end of the day, there's still some of those sentiments that exist in some places in our organization. And for me, I'm like, okay, that'll be fun to try to fix those as well. So for me, it's mostly, I would say, always, I want to be known as a great leader, not a great female leader.
Right.
Yeah, that's what's the most important to me. But I have come to appreciate that it is also important that that girls and young women and other female leaders can see themselves in my position someday. And so it is important to own that I am the first woman leader of this network.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's pretty easy to see how your faith can develop a servant leader in you. I'm curious how you, or maybe where you got the trait in you of I like a challenge. I mean, you signed up for the Peace Corps. You like a challenge. That's not an easy task. So where do you think that came from? Does your faith play into that, or family, or just background?
I don't know. Part of me feels like I'm just hardwired. You
Yeah,
know, it's probably a little bit there. So there's some nature and some nurture in here. I'm
sure.
pretty sure. I did grow up as a middle child, so I'm not sure that was kind of an interesting place, because I usually attribute my middle childhoodness to being comfortable with gray and being good with negotiation and diplomacy and kind of showing up, trying to listen to both sides.
Bridge
But
builder.
yeah, as a bridge builder. But my sister and I were competitive when we were young, and I don't know why, because we were so different. Maybe it was because we're so different. Like, we had such different interests that I probably need to go to therapy to totally unpack all of this. But what I will say is my father, I think I get the kind of achievement orientation from him. I mean, interestingly, my dad was a master at fooling you into understanding what was most important. He would always downplay really what was most important, so that he kind of tried to outwit you, I would say, in terms of he would say, I don't know. He always had this line. He's like, you don't have to be the smartest. You just have to be the nicest. But you also knew he wanted you to be the smartest too.
Yeah.
But he really did. But he lived by the value of, you have to be the nicest. And the form that took was in school. If you got anything less than a perfect conduct grade, which is impacted by how much you talk, and even if you had straight A's and straight A pluses, if you came home with an S minus, like a satisfactory minus, you would get grounded for at least 3 weeks, even if your grades were perfect. And even if it was only because I would say, Dad, all I was doing was talking because I got done with all my work. It's like, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be the smartest. You just have to be the nicest. Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know. I went all over the place with that answer.
No, that's okay. I like hearing where the challenge came, or where the rise to the occasion, rise to the challenge comes from. That's great. Well, how can a group like this, so we name ourselves Being Christ's Presence in the Y, serve and support you? And I would say there's personally, as well as you in your role with the YUSA organizationally, and sometimes it's hard to really divvy up those two, but just want to know, how could we support you?
First, I want to say thank you to so many of you who have personally supported me. I have felt supported by this group early on. Again, going back to something I said, to come into an organization where I'm careful to say this because I know that not everybody feels this way, that I've had the privilege of feeling like I belong, because you can see your faith, like literally, if you want to, or you can talk about it, and you can pull it into your work day. That actually doesn't work for a lot of our staff, and I think so. I would say, first of all, for me, that has been a blessing, and I am incredibly grateful for it. And there are several of you who are on this call who have given great, personal support to me, and I just say thank you to that. And so please keep doing that. It does uplift me when I hear from some of you individually, or there was a call and someone says, "We prayed for you today." And I think, thank you, because boy, did I need it today. And so that has been really real and really, it felt really good for me. I think as we move into the future, continuing to help all of you as leaders of your faith, leaders in our organization, is helping us think and actually engage with more of our movement about in a way that is inclusive and helps us understand how we express the Christian values of the Y in a way that doesn't ever feel exclusionary and ideally always feels inclusionary. And I don't know, all the answers to how we do that, but I need you all in the same way that I need those who say they feel alienated sometimes because there's Christian in our name, to be part of that conversation. Again, I think your openness to have conversations and to help the Christian heritage and values show up in the most inclusionary way, I think, is what's most important for our organization at this moment in time.
Yeah. So for those who identify as Christian, don't get it S-.
Yes.
Be kind, be caring.
That's exactly right.
Put it out. Yeah, that's a good word. So there's a question that we'll kind of wrap up with this and we'll have some Q&A, but I definitely want to ask how we can pray for you. But there's a question my spiritual director asks me each month, and I always know it's coming, and I'm never quite prepared for it. And she just says, "How is your soul?" So I just want to ask, how is your soul? And I think with that question, we will learn how to pray for you.
I think this might be like the weirdest adjective to use. It's my soul feels, well, first of all, two words come to mind immediately. I don't know what I'll just say them. It feels grounded and it feels realistic. Like my soul feels it feels comfortable where it is, but not at all comfortable. It feels comfortable, but comfortable with the discomfort as well. If that makes any sense. Like it feels, I feel satisfied is not the right word, but I feel grounded in where my soul is because it also is filled with dynamic tension of comfort and discomfort.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
No, I think it does. You've stepped out onto the water. You're praying Jesus is with you, but you're grounded because he is. That's yeah. I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth with that, but I think in the unknowns, you can still feel grounded.
And I do have, going back to when I said, when I was pushing too hard for what was next or where I was supposed to be, it didn't happen. And so I do believe, I trust I'm where I'm supposed to be right now. And when I'm not supposed to be in the place I am anymore, then that will be revealed to me as well. Like I really do believe in that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I start every single day with, it's almost the same prayer almost every single day. And it's often happening when I'm running, because I think that's that's when the lines of communication are most open for me, it feels like. And it's always for courage, compassion, and discernment. Like, please let me be courageous. Please let me be courageous in a compassionate way. And please help me make decisions with compassion and courage.
That's good. Yeah, courage, compassion, and discernment. And that will ground your feet. That's good. Well, we will definitely be praying for that. So we are going to transition now to a time to let others interact. We've already been getting some questions